I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we reflect on the continuing Ukrainian operation into Russia, as reports come in about seized settlements and Kyiv's forces even setting up an office in Kursk. Then we look at the implications for the Russian economy as reality bites, and deep dive into Moscow's response to this growing crisis.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 15th of August, 2 years and 178 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Economics Editor, Szu Chan, and calling in live from Washington, D.C., Kateryna Stepanenko from the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War. I started by asking Dom, however, for the latest news from the front lines in Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi Francis, hi team. So, marginal advances in the last 24 hours by Ukrainian forces in Kursk and Belgorod Oblast in Russia. This is likely due to the increasing Russian reinforcements being pushed into the region. There's been a slight expansion of the assessed Ukrainian positions to the east and the northeast of Koronovo. That's the town sort of 20 k's-ish or so north of Dza. That's based on reports from Russia's MOD about where they say they have been repelling Ukrainian attacks. Now, they may well have repelled them. As I said yesterday, Ukrainian forces may be attempting to bypass areas where they contact Russian forces. Either way, it indicates there's a Ukrainian presence in those areas, and those reports by Moscow of those repelled attacks are increasing in number, so we can get some sort of idea about where the movement is. Also been slight advances to the southeast of Szu Chan. Geolocated footage published yesterday by the Institute for the Study of War shows Ukrainian forces operating just northwest of Ulyanok. That's about 10 k's southeast of Szu Chan. There seem to be some elements of Ukrainian forces thought to be in the vicinity of Kyiv. That's about another 10 k's or so further southeast. Disputed claims there. Russia saying that they're not, and they're saying they've got journalists there reporting from the town of Kyiv. But something's happening there. It might just be Ukrainian reconnaissance elements that are having a look around and then getting the hell out of there. But certainly the level of engagements and the level of reporting from there suggests that any Ukrainian presence is not thought to be in great strength, certainly not elsewhere that we've seen around the bazaars. Now, Ukrainian special forces say they captured 102 Russian and Chechen soldiers in Kursk Oblast yesterday. This comes from a source in the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine. This source is speaking to the Kyiv Independent. The source says the SBU carried out an operation on a Russian military base yesterday that resulted in the largest single capture of Russian troops so far in the war. Obviously, the capture of the Ukrainian Mariupol defenders was bigger than 200, but this seems to be the largest capture of Russian troops. The prisoners of war are said to belong to the 144th Guards Motor Rifle Division and the Akhmat unit. That's a Chechen group of forces fighting for Russia. Now, you may remember we reported Apti Aludinov, who's the commander of the Akhmat unit. He's also an official in Russia's defense ministry. A few days ago, he actually acknowledged Russian troop losses, a very rare statement. Don't often hear these kind of things. He back then, last week, he said, "Our people died. That's a fact. The enemy has entered several settlements." He did, though, go on to say that NATO, was it NATO or French troops? It was all a bit confused, but NATO troops, I think it may also have been French, looking forward to sending body bags back to Paris, I think was the quote, were responsible. It couldn't possibly be the Ukrainians. This is yet more totally denying Ukraine's any agency whatsoever. It couldn't be Ukraine invading Kursk. It's got to be NATO. Now, all this comes on the back of yesterday's news in which Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Alexander Syrsky reported that Ukrainian forces operating in Kursk had captured more than 100 Russian troops. Now, we are probably talking about two different events here, although given the difficulty in getting information, it is not impossible that this is double reporting of the same event. Sersky yesterday was talking about 100 Russian prisoners of war. Now today there's another report of 200 Russian prisoners of war. They probably are separate, but we're not sure. We just don't know. Either way, any amount of prisoners of war will be helpful in future prisoner exchanges, especially for the remnants of the left of those Mariupol defenders. Now then, an exciting opportunity for anyone who likes travel and meeting new people, although there are some caveats. Russian authorities have appealed for citizens to apply for jobs digging trenches in Kursk. So Avito, a Russian job site, posted the listings, these adverts, with a salary of 150,000 rubles to 370,000 rubles. That's about 1,300 to 3,000, 1,300 pounds, 3,000 pounds, about very roughly $2,000 to $4,000. Not going to get too specific because I don't think you're actually going to apply for it. Anyway, the job listing details what they say is round-the-clock work. Yes, please. Round-the-clock work involving digging trenches on the second line of defence. It says, we provide 3 meals a day, all necessary tools, work clothes, transportation to the place of work at the expense of the company. Anyway, you'll be able to find it online if you want to sign up. Now then, I think that must have been reasonably popular because ISW are saying that commercially available satellite imagery from Maxar, which was taken on Monday, shows a set of newly dug series of field fortifications, including trenches and anti-vehicle ditches southwest of Lvov. That is on that main east-west highway, the road coming out of Ukraine through Rilsk and then running through Lvov into Kursk city itself. That there have been reports of Ukrainian forces up there. I'm very dubious about those reports. If anything, I think they were probably long-range reconnaissance. But this is about 30 or 40 k's northeast of Szu Chan, so not thought to be any main elements of Ukrainian forces. But they are digging in. Russia is digging in around Lvov, and we've also seen those reports in the last few days that they're digging in around the Kursk nuclear power plant as well. Next, Russia has told Belarus to stop freight transit on the rail lines in the region, any rail coming out of Belarus into this area of Russia. They're saying this is due to, quote, large-scale operational transfer of troops in the direction of Kursk Oblast, following yesterday's announcement of a state of emergency declared by Belgorod Oblast Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov. Basically, that just restricts the state of emergency, restricts movement, which is what you need to do in a time of crisis. So this move today to say to Belarus, look, just lay off all the normal commercial freight on the rail lines is yet another indication that they are, well, feeling a bit of pressure and need to muster all the logistic resources they can. Authorities in Kursk region, we believe, have been ordered to evacuate a further 20,000 civilians because the Ukraine's advances seem to be, are ongoing. Alexander Sersky says they're doing 1 to 2 kilometers a day. I think that's a sweeping statement because it covers a reasonable geographic area with differing operational scenarios up and down the line. But yeah, 20,000 more Russian civilians evacuated. And Alexei Smirnov, the governor of Kursk, said on Telegram earlier today that police would be coordinating the evacuation from Glushkov district that borders Ukraine of these 20,000. Now then, another reference from ISW. They're citing Russian opposition outlet Mobilization News today, who are reporting, or they're citing it today, the reporting was from yesterday, saying that Russian conscripts in the spring draft, two drafts a year in Russia for conscripts, but the spring draft class are going to be sent to Kursk. That draft came from Moscow, Leningrad, Kaliningrad, Sverdlovsk, Murmansk and Samara oblasts. Now this move has apparently earned a backlash from human rights activists and relatives in Russia who are protesting against the use of conscripts being sent to active combat areas. Ukrainian officials, for their part, they reiterated their position that they don't want to stay in Kursk and Belgorod. Ombudsman Dmitry Lubinets said Ukrainian forces have formed a buffer zone in Kursk Oblast for self-defense purposes, and President Zelensky yesterday said the creation of a buffer zone in the Kursk region is a step to protect our border communities from daily hostile shelling. More on that in a moment. Just finally on this bit, Francis, presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak gave an interview to independent Russian language outlet Meduza. in which he said Ukraine's main political goals of this Kursk and Belgorod operation are fourfold. Push Russian artillery away so they can't target Ukrainian civilians. Cut Russian logistic lines resupplying troops in the northern part of Ukraine. Put more pressure on Putin's political position. And finally, as he says, to bring the war directly to Russian territory. That's the update from Russia, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. As you say, updates there from extraordinary, I can't believe I'm saying it, Ukraine's front in Russia. Now, where are we in terms of Russia's front in Ukraine?
Yeah, just a couple of notes here. Russian attacks across Ukraine in the last 24 hours killed at least 5, injured about 20, we think, regional authorities reporting in this morning. Strikes included a drone attack on a vehicle near Kyiv that killed 2 medics, a man and a woman. Medics from the Hospitalers Medical Battalion were killed there. Other casualties in Kupiansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and a village just outside Pokrovsk in the Donbass. Now, other regions in Ukraine, including Sumy, Mykolaiv and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts, also came under attack, but no reports yet of civilian casualties there. The Ukrainian Air Force says it downed all 29 kamikaze drones launched by Russia overnight. They say Russia also launched 3 Kh-59 missiles from Kursk Oblast. No reports of where they went. They may have accounted for some of those casualties. And then just finally, we spoke yesterday about the attack the night before, so Tuesday, Wednesday night attack on 4. We mentioned 3 airfields inside Russia, hundreds of Ks inside Russia, one of which was 200 kilometers east of Moscow. There was actually, later on in the day, it was said that there was a 4th airfield, Russian airfield hit, that 4th one being inside Kursk. But from that attack, the attack on the Borisovlest air base, which is about 150 Ks away from, outside the front lines, images from that, satellite images from Planet Labs today show that drone attack hit a number of hangars and clearly hit some jets there. It's difficult to tell exactly, but there are some sort of splatters that indicate that jets as well as the storage and maintenance hangars were hit. And I'll take a pause there, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. Now, before we turn to our 2 guests to discuss the Russian military response to the incursion and the economic picture in Russia, or another important front, of course, just a few political updates to run through, first of all, from me. In previous episodes, we've discussed in detail the multiple motivations behind Ukraine's incursion, from changing the political conversation, avoiding debates about freezing the front lines where they are, because Russia now obviously couldn't agree to that, drawing Russian forces away from front lines in Ukraine, etc., etc. But another benefit, of course, is what the operation means for the border communities within Ukraine, those that have been under constant attack, shellfire, etc. for many months now. And this morning, President Zelensky has praised the armed forces involved in the incursion for the creation of a buffer zone in the Kursk region, which is a step to protect, he said, our border communities from daily hostile shelling. Now, no doubt that's a secondary consideration, but the language is interesting, which is why I mention it. As discussed on the podcast before, the notion of buffer zones is one exceptionally powerful in the Russian consciousness. It fueled much of Stalin's Cold War strategy, seeking a protective shield of states, including Ukraine, to deter future Western invasions akin to that the Soviet Union had suffered during the Second World War. So using that term, buffer zone, in this context only underscores the embarrassment of all of this for Moscow. Now, there's much reporting this morning in the British press that Challenger 2 tanks have been used by Ukrainian troops inside Russia for the first time. We at the Telegraph are cautious in confirming that, given the nature of the shaky edited footage that we have seen. Dom, in particular, I know is very sceptical and tells me that he used to be an AFV instructor, whatever that is. But UK government policy, regardless, does allow Kyiv's forces to use British weapons, with the exception of Storm Shadow missiles, on Russian soil. An MOD spokesperson has said there has been no change in UK government policy. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, Ukraine has a clear right of self-defence against Russia's illegal attacks. That does not preclude operations inside Russia. Now, that tallies with the position put forward vocally by the Estonians and the Finns yesterday, so Britain is not some sort of outlier here, but nonetheless, it would mark an interesting development if those tanks have indeed been used. Now, on Storm Shadows, of course, there's been a whole saga here with various developments happening since the new government came in. Indeed, there was speculation that Storm Shadows had been given permission to be used to the Ukrainians by the Labour government, but that has not, as far as we understand, been given, at least not officially. But there are rumours this morning that Kyiv may make some deliberate overture to London to give permission for those missiles on Russian soil to be used in this incursion, but we're yet to see that if so. As discussed previously, there's been a public back and forth on this, and the success of the operation now might well tip the balance in favour of more permissions being given to Ukraine's forces. We shall see, and stick with us, because if there are any developments on that, we will of course let you know. Now, in other news, just briefly, James Rothwell of the Telegraph reported on the podcast yesterday from Berlin, the very latest on the Nord Stream 2 case, as German prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian man over the 2022 sabotage. Unsurprisingly, Kyiv has since denied Kyiv had any involvement in the explosions which damaged the gas pipeline and pointed the finger at Russia. Instead, Mikhailo Podolyak, the presidential advisor that I interviewed for the podcast back in February, has said in a statement that such an act can only be carried out with extensive technical and financial resources. And who possessed all this at the time of the bombing? Only Russia. It has to be said, though, that is no longer the orthodox view of what occurred. We've been reporting on that incident ever since it took place, and the speculation since, with huge investigations done in the German press, which point the finger firmly at the Ukrainians. Indeed, the Wall Street Journal has just published a piece in the last 24 hours where they claim a private businessman funded what they called the shoestring operation, which was overseen by a top Ukrainian general. President Zelensky apparently approved that plan, but then tried to unsuccessfully call it off when it spooked Western allies. Now, I won't go into a deep dive on the story now, no pun intended, but if you are interested in the latest on Nord Stream, do check out that long read by the Journal, which is in the show notes. It's very interesting and will bring you up to date on the latest speculations following that news from Berlin. Now, finally, before we get to our guests, just a quick update on the case of Russian-American Kateryna, the Los Angeles spa employee and ballet dancer who was on trial in Russia for treason after donating to a Ukrainian charity. She has just been jailed for 12 years after pleading guilty last week at her trial in Yekaterinburg. The charge against her was based on a donation of just $50 that she made in February 2022 to a charity supporting Ukraine. Just another case that underlines the clampdown in Russia, showing no sign of relenting despite the prisoner exchange a fortnight ago, nor in the apparent Kremlin strategy of taking high-value foreign prisoners that they can use as leverage in dealings with the West. But that's where we are in the lead political stories today. Before we return to the front lines with Kateryna of the Institute for the Study of War, let's just stay on domestic affairs a little bit longer in Russia. Szu Chan, economic editor here at The Telegraph, thank you so much for your time today, which I know has to be brief, given you're writing various stories up as we speak. But as David mentioned yesterday, you've written an extended piece into why Putin's inflation battle is weakening Russia from within. Of course, a story we've monitored very, very closely ever since the war began. But what's the very latest on the Russian economy?
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. So, yes, there's a lot of domestic affairs going on here in the UK, but I just thought around the world, inflation is basically falling. It's on a downward trajectory. In Russia, things are very different. I mean, I think about a year ago when we would have spoken, inflation in Russia was actually around 2%. That's mainly due to falling energy prices. Obviously, one thing that Russia can do is keep its energy prices low. But it has risen substantially since. So just to give you a little bit of the backdrop, at the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, inflation spiked up to almost 18%, but it was gradually falling. Last month, it was 9.1%, and it's going up steadily. And there are reasons for Russians to be worried about this, because after the initial invasion, inflation spiked. mainly because of sanctions. People just couldn't get stuff anymore. But there are more structural, more permanent reasons for the spike this time. I mean, on a basic level, lots of stuff in the shops is going up. Russia's central bank produces a report every month where it tells you which goods are going up. So eggs, that's been in the headlines. I mean, Vladimir Putin very rarely apologises for anything, but he was apologising last year. I remember he went on TV and he said sorry for the price of eggs, which are going up by about 50%. And if you go to a Russian shop, 10 eggs cost roughly £2. I mean, when you think of it, a pensioner gets around £40 a week in their pension. So it is a substantial amount. And if you look at other basic goods like garlic, bananas, loans, because interest rates have been going up in order to try and cool the economy, they're all going up in double digits. So it's very interesting. If you look at the Central Bank of Russia's report, one of the categories, the line items that they break out is actually caviar, which I don't think you'd find the Office for National Statistics in the UK doing. But caviar is actually cheaper than it was a year ago, which perhaps goes to show that perhaps the elite are reining in their budgets in order to cope. But as I mentioned, the central bank has been raising interest rates in order to try and keep a lid on rising price pressures. They're up to 18%. And in their latest report, the central bank governor there suggested that they might even touch the record high of 20% that they hit in the wake of Russia's invasion back in 2022. So that's the backdrop. The Russian economy is still growing, but that is basically because Vladimir Putin is spending billions on financing this war. I mean, you know, I should have started this by saying that we can't trust all of the figures coming out in Russia. But one thing I'm trying desperately to find out, I'm still trying to dig in, is how much does Russia have? A lot of people ask me, when is the money going to run out in Russia? We just don't know. But I think from the actions of the Kremlin, we can see that the pressure is on as Putin is spending more money on the war and as defense spending becomes more of its annual budget. So basically, wartime salaries have gone up. There's more money to pay for salaries for blue-collar jobs such as welders and weavers. I mean, in some cases, these jobs and these people have seen their salaries quadruple, and that's pushed up prices even further. So this is just a spiral. It feeds into itself. It's a very classic way that inflation just keeps going up and up. And that is worrying for Putin, which is why a few months ago, pretty much without any disquiet, he decided to raise taxes. So one of the first things he did, actually when he entered office, he said, our income tax system is too complicated. So there used to be several bands. And he said, we're going to have a flat tax of about 13%. Actually, from next year, he's bringing those tiers back. And the highest earners in Russia will start paying a 22% tax rate on their income. So, I mean, there are clear signs that money is tight. I mean, if you look at the appointment of the defence minister, he is a trained economist and he's been told to clearly rein those budgets in.
Thanks, Sue. The way you said garlic bananas, I thought you were going to say garlic bread there as an essential foodstuff. It certainly is in my household. But yes, next question. When you look at the basic foodstuffs, as you have been describing there, are there any other signs that we should be looking for of a economy in jeopardy in terms of perhaps in other parts of Russia or on specific products or produce? Because it's very hard, as you say, for us to get a clear sense of the healthiness of the Russian economy. But it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on what perhaps we should be looking for that would give the other signs, other signals that things might not all be dandy.
Yeah, so one of the things that has surprised economists is Russia's growth rate. So if you look on the surface, Russia is growing. But as I said before, that is pretty much entirely financed by Putin raiding the war chest to pay for this. If you look at the unemployment rate, you know, on the surface, it's close to a record low. But that's because they can't find people to do the jobs, because those people have swapped the shop floor for the front line. So in order to keep the economy going, to keep it ticking over, they've had to really whack up wages across the economy. And ordinarily people would be boasting about a record or near record low unemployment rate. But this is not something to be boasting about when you don't have the workforce there to keep the economy ticking over, which is why, if you just look at the statistics, unemployment falling, growth still steady. This is something politicians would normally want to boast about. But in this case, these are danger signs, because it is very clear Putin cannot sustain this level of spending. There aren't enough Russia was already facing a demographic crisis before the start of the war, with the population continuing to shrink. A lot of Russians have already fled. They're in other places. They've set up new lives. And so this will eventually lead to much slower growth. And this is a permanent thing, permanently low growth, permanently high inflation. In my world, we call that stagflation, and that is very much a bad thing. And we can see Putin is raising taxes. He's raising taxes on corporates. So next year, corporations will pay a 25% tax rate instead of a 20% tax rate. He's tapping his oil and gas companies for more money as well. He's looking for ways to boost the coffers because he's running out of options.
It's not a question of can the Russian economy survive, it's for how long at these current levels, and that remains very much an open question. Just before you have to dash back to the desk, we've had a question in from a listener called Dave. I hope it's not David Knowles, he's meant to be on holiday. But he asks, hello, I'm an avid listener to Ukraine the Latest. Thank you, Dave. I understand that you'll be discussing with your financial editor the Russian economy. I've heard from another source that both the Turkish and Chinese banks have stopped trading with Russia due to secondary sanctions. I was just wondering whether you can confirm this, and might it be worth mentioning in more detail if so? So there you are, Sue. What do you think?
Yeah, so my whole job through this whole invasion is trying to piece together from other sources what's going on in the Russian economy. So one of the things that has been going on is what we call parallel imports. So a lot of stuff that Russia used to get from the West, you can't get them anymore. So I'm speaking to you through an iPhone. You can't get an iPhone. You can't walk into an Apple store in Moscow and get an iPhone, but you can get one if you buy one via Turkey. So countries have started exporting things into other countries, which are then brought into Russia via other means. And you can see it through trade data. You can see the more business is rising through some of Russia's allies, should we say. It's very interesting this question that's come in. So I was speaking to a business owner in China, and one of the things, so he runs a sort of a small goods business there, and we were talking about he knows some businesses and the way they used to get things into Russia was all these intermediary businesses were somewhere in the north of China, and a lot in the Middle East actually were set up in order to keep goods flowing from China into Russia. At the start of the year, this has started to slow. And what he said to me is that he's spoken to a number of businesses that said, look, Chinese banks, they won't deal with Russian banks anymore. And at the end of the day, if I'm not going to get paid, why am I going to keep doing business? So, I think that has a geopolitical message as well, because obviously Putin was in Beijing for a state visit earlier this year. They reiterated their commitment to this no limits friendship. Obviously, China's been buying a lot of Russian oil on the cheap. But, with November's election in the US is looming, and China is obviously very wary of the impact of secondary sanctions, and if the West does tighten the screw on other countries, obviously China's decided that in this case it's better to close down some of the avenues to Russia.
Well, thank you very much, Sue. I know you've got to dash off. Really appreciate your perspectives, and let's not leave it so long next time. We'll get you on again very soon. And that now just leaves us to go to our final guest for today, Kateryna Stepanenko of the Institute for the Study of War. Always a pleasure to hear from anyone from the Institute for the Study of War, but it's been a while since we've heard from Kateryna. Now, I imagine it's been an extraordinarily busy few days for you, Kateryna, as it has for us reporting on the incursion in Kursk. So thank you very much for your time. Let's start then with looking at the Russian response. We've spoken a lot about how Ukraine has conducted this operation, but what are your reflections as somebody who follows this so closely at the Institute for the Study of War on the nature of the Russian reaction and how effective it's been, first of all?
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a while for sure. I guess I will probably start with the analysis of what Putin is doing to respond to what another country would count as a life or death situation, right? It's a threat against the Russian sovereignty, and you can interpret that. However, we don't see Putin do that. We don't see Putin declare war against Ukraine. We don't see Putin declare a martial law. We don't see Putin call up any mobilizations. And in fact, we actually see him signal that he wants to continue the recruitment of volunteers and irregular personnel. And it is quite interesting to see how much effort Putin is putting to sweep this under this rug, to make sure that the military is not in charge of this operation, but rather a combination of FSB, Rosgvardia is heading this operation. And all of this tells us that Putin really does not want to have war be in Russia. He does not want his society to know that there is a prospect in which there could be war within the territory of Russia, and that this war that he had started because of his own imperialist ambitions is spreading and affecting his society. So I think one of the big components of this is most of the reactions that we see from Putin with the way that he's trying to portray this more so than a military operation, but his response to evacuations or civilian society problems, scolding his governors. All of this tells us that his main priority is regime stability. And it's quite fascinating to see his narrative really shift from we're fighting this war for our sovereignty, we're fighting a war for existence of Russia against NATO, and all of that rhetoric really disappear after the Kursk incursion. So really fascinating developments out here.
Now, I'm going to be blunt, Kateryna, and ask, do you think that this is an existential threat for Putin if the Ukrainians are able to stay and hold on to any territory in Russia? Or do you think that's over-egging it somewhat?
I don't think that Ukrainians intend to stay in Kursk or intend to capture any territories and hold them for a long period of time. I think Ukrainians, what they're doing is they're regaining the initiative on the battlefield, and they're proving to the entirety of the international community, as well as to Russians themselves, that Putin is a weakened persona. He's not in a strong, negotiating position like he had tried to establish himself over the past couple of months. And frankly, I think that for Putin, it's going to be really interesting to see how else is he going to address the problems that are emerging. The first problem, of course, is the fact that we are seeing that he does not have enough operational reserves to make sure that his border is safe and defended at all times. The second is the use of conscripts. This is a huge problem for Putin's regime health, because in the past, we had seen that Putin is extremely sensible to the problems of using conscripts in combat operations, and the backlash that the Russian society generates in response to that. If you remember, in 2022, the very, very beginning, I believe in early March, Putin had a very demonstrative meeting with the mothers of conscripts, and he had made a clear promise to them that he's not going to use conscripts in combat operations. And it's going to be really interesting to see how he's going to try to address the growing reports about Ukrainians capturing POWs. And that might actually have some implications on his decision-making, as well as his ability to maintain the regime and his popularity on the same level. But I think it's a little too early to tell how catastrophic this is for Putin. I think the number one thing that it tells us is that his policy decisions in 2023 in 2022 continued to undermine Ukrainians' capabilities. And I simply don't think that he or any Russian senior military officials really thought that Ukrainians might conduct a large operation to take advantage of the policy decision, which was essentially pull out all of the Russian forces from the border area and replace them with conscripts so that Russia could continue tactical advances in Ukraine.
It's a really interesting point that I've not heard anywhere else about the significance of these conscripts that are being captured and the political difficulties that sows for Putin. So thank you for that. Interested too in the people that Putin is entrusting with handling this. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about them and who they are and the approach they're likely to take. I think they were surprise choices.
Yeah, I mean, the first one that he had appointed to this role of managing the Kursk counter-terrorist operation, again, not a martial law, again, not a war with Ukraine, but a counter-terrorist operation. Very interesting rhetorical mention is Bortnikov. Bortnikov is the head of the FSB, and he has been a trusted official within the Kremlin ranks, namely because he was allegedly responsible for negotiating a deal between deceased Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin and Lukashenko and during the mutiny in 2023. So that was an interesting appointment because, one, it tells us that he is not confident in appointing his military personnel, military commanders to take charge of this operation. Two, as I mentioned before, that Putin really wants to downplay the scale and the importance of this incursion. And it is an interesting factor that he's appointing someone who had previously managed his crises relatively well. The other aspect of this is the appointment of Alexei Dumin. Dumin used to be Putin's security guard, and then later he turned into Tula Oblast governor, and most recently he was appointed presidential aide. Dumin is a peculiar figure within the Kremlin because he had previous connections with Wagner Group, as well as he had reported conflict with former defense minister Sergei Shoigu. They were competing for the position of defense minister. And Dumin also gained the reputation of solving Putin's crises earlier in 2023, also participating in resolving the Wagner mutiny. So we were seeing a parallel here where Putin is really leaning into the people that he knows are managing that he knows have experience with managing problems as it pertains to specifically regime problems. So not necessarily military, but regime problems. It's really interesting to see that a lot of the mill bloggers that we're following and a lot of political commentators in Russia had focused on Dumin's appointment almost from a very Stalinist perspective, as in Dumin taking a role in which he's going to oversee Bortnikov and FSB and Rosgvardia and how well they execute the Kursk counter-terrorist operation. So that Dumin necessarily is not an official who is managing the operation itself, but he's overseeing how someone else is executing this operation and is going to provide some damning report to Putin and basically report and snitch out on a variety of different military commanders and FSB and Rosgvardia about their performance. So the way that his appointment has been portrayed is that it is going to be life or death for some military commanders. And it's going to be really interesting to see if any command changes or official changes will take place after the Kursk incursion.
Kateryna, hi, it's Dom here. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for all the work you and the team do. I know Francis has got another couple of questions, but I have one specifically on Alexei Dumin. I was going to save it for my final thought, so I'm seeing myself off here. I've got about 30 seconds now to think up a new one. But I've been looking at some interesting thoughts from Konstantin Sonin, the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. He's talking about Dumin's apparent appointment to be responsible for Kursk. And Mr. Sonin was saying that he is not sure how prominent a role Alexei Dumin will take because, and he says, Putin is terrified of any of his subordinates. He's terrified more of their success than their failures. Against this backdrop of the Moscow elite, the Siloviki, if you like, who might be looking for a way to get rid of a guy who's shown that he's not good for business. If Dumin succeeds, then maybe he's the golden boy. So I just wonder what your thoughts were there on whether or not this chap has been put in a very operational role to live or die by the successful failure of the defence of Kursk. And just that wider point of, does Putin actually, we know it's like mafia-like, he doesn't really use the system, use the organisation, he just uses his family and people he trusts and so on and so forth. Do you put much stock in that he would fear people underneath him getting too much credit?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring up Konstantin Sonin's work. He's phenomenal, and his analysis of internal Russian politics are something that I definitely recommend all of your listeners to check out. I do agree with that assessment. Putin really does not want to have someone outshine him and be better than him. And so he does tend to put a lot of his officials, such as Bortnikov or Dumin, in positions in which they might sustain failure, which is probably why we see that Gerasimov is still sticking around and stuck around for that long, despite the fact that he has been incompetent in military planning. He has been incompetent in generally many things that we have seen before the war as well as during the war. So I do see that argument. I don't think that Dumin himself is taking on a role. I've seen some sources misreport Dumin's alleged position, right? There's reports that Dumin is somehow overshadowing Bortnikov, or that Putin is now no longer confident in Bortnikov's ability to resolve the situation. I don't think that's the case. I think that this is Putin's way to ensure that whatever that he assigned to Bortnikov or Rosgvardia or the military commanders actually gets executed. Whether Dumin fails or succeeds, we'll have to see. But I agree with that sentiment. I think that Putin keeps personnel, officials in his ranks that kind of create a central figure for himself. So he gets to be the centrist official who is not nearly as involved, but then on some cases is involved. And in that sense, I agree with that assessment.
Well, thank you, Kateryna, and thanks, Dom, for your question. There'll be an opportunity to ask more in a second. But just wanted to zoom out a little bit, if I may, Kateryna, and look at generally the health of Putin's regime at the moment. I'm not trying to spell the idea that it's in severe peril at the moment. I don't think it is. But nonetheless, it is under pressure on multiple fronts, economically, as we've addressed today, given the Kursk operation as well, and indeed the general challenges of waging a war that was meant to be a 3-day special operation. How would you broadly assess the health of the Kremlin at the moment, and indeed of Russia more broadly?
I think the Kremlin is doing okay with managing both the situation in Kursk as well as the situation that it's created for itself with its aggression in Ukraine. First and foremost, the Kremlin has been adapting its information space to address any military failures. So a big line right now that is going on in Russia that you shouldn't really trust Telegram channels, that there's only select Telegram channels that produce good information, and you should trust them about Kursk. And then also a lot of the propaganda has shifted to say that there's some problems on the battlefield, but we're generally doing good. And for a person, say that you live in Yekaterinburg and you see a report like this, you're more than likely to trust it because it seems credible enough. And you're probably not following close along on every single tactical development that is happening on the battlefield. So I think it's been relatively okay for the Kremlin's presentation of this war. Now, Putin is also not asking for significant sacrifices from his people at this point. He is increasingly asking more of them in the economical sense, but in terms of force generation, namely compulsory military service, he is doing everything that the Russian society wants him to do, which is don't mobilize. The Russians really don't like mobilization. They don't like conscription. They don't like compulsory service. We've seen the impacts of that during Afghanistan. We've also seen the impacts of compulsory military service during Chechen wars and how damaging to the regime that was. And Putin is doing everything in his power to make sure that he does not have to take that step. He does not have to mobilize and ask those sacrifices from his people. And I think that's what's really keeping a lot of the sentiments about the war and the loss that comes with it is the financial incentives. He made sure that every single personnel type within his military or irregular forces is compensated, and that their families are compensated. And I think until Putin's ability to compensate people for the sacrifices that are being made in Ukraine, I don't think that his regime is going to be in a weakened spot. So for now, I think that they're doing okay when it comes to Putin's presentation, his appeal. Now, can this situation change in 2 to 3 years? Absolutely, because as was mentioned earlier on the show, that Putin cannot sustain this economical situation forever. He can't have his society be paid off millions of rubles just for one contract serviceman. And this is going to be a really interesting dynamic to observe, both with the increases in taxes, as well as with his clear need for more personnel, because his borders are not defended.
And just one final question for me before going over to Dom, just to push you a little bit more on this. It seems to me we've touched on here one of the critical questions of the war, which is where is that tipping point for Putin's regime, for Russian society, where because of those pressures on multiple fronts, military, economic, etc., that the system begins to implode or becomes seriously challenged, and that begins to have major ramifications on the front line and indeed in people's wallets in their homes. Do you have a sense of what might change and the timescales involved? What would need to happen in the short term, maybe, let's say short to medium term of a year, for us to really begin to see something quite drastic happening? Or is this really only feasibly going to be something longer term that might well begin to change the state of play?
I think in short term, it would probably be general mobilization. If Putin realizes that he cannot win this war with crypto mobilization, with volunteer recruitment, and has to make that sacrifice and ask Russians to make this sacrifice, that could be something that could trigger a larger problem. Now, it's really challenging to say right now to what extent this is actually going to destabilize Russian society, but it's clear that it is a perceived threat that Putin has. And so right now he's doing everything in his power to avoid it, even though it compromises a lot of his actually rational military decisions. The long-term ramifications of this, I think, is economical, truly. For Putin to generate the forces that he has on the battlefield right now, he has to make promises not only for enlistment bonuses, monthly salaries, but he's also making promises for compensations for death, injuries, compensations to children and wives, and free education and pensions and medical benefits. All of this will add up. And when Putin is unable to, or Putin or the Kremlin, his successor, are unable to meet those promises that they have made during this time, this is going to be a very, very challenging time for the Kremlin. This is what happened in the 90s after the fall of Soviet Union. We saw that the Kremlin simply couldn't offer the same benefits that had been offered to pensioners throughout their entire life in Soviet Union, and that had devastating impacts on the stability of the Russian society. So in the long term, looking from at least the personal costs that are taking place right now, I think that this is, in the long term, this is going to be a very challenging thing for the Kremlin to execute in terms of the policy debates, the policy commitments that they made to sustain this war effort. I think that right now, Putin is not really thinking long term. I think that his objective is to, in the near future, to convince the West to surrender Ukraine. So not have negotiations with Ukraine, but have the West sign the rights to Ukraine. Have the West force Ukraine to accept neutrality or give up its territorial integrity or give up its sovereignty and its international right to self-determination. And I think that's Putin's objective here. He's pushing every single day on the front lines. He is making these grandiose promises that he's probably not going to be able to live up to in the future without a long-term plan, with a short-term plan of just proving to the West that Russia could just outlive this war, that Russia is stronger and that Ukraine has no chance of winning, which I think the Kursk situation is really showing us right now that we really shouldn't underestimate Ukrainians, and we shouldn't underestimate Ukraine's ability to contest the initiative in creative ways. And it really shows us that beyond this operation, Putin has been trying to create an image that Russia is invincible and an inexhaustible power, and that Ukraine is hopeless. Kursk is really showing us right now that Russia suffers from many important vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and a skillful Ukrainian operation, which properly supported by the US or Western equipment, can really take advantage of that. And I think it's really destroying a lot of the facade that Putin has been erecting for the past couple of months, with the objective of finally weeding out our support sometime either this fall or next year.
Kateryna, hi, Dom again. Just a couple more from me, if I may. Regular viewers or readers of your work will see numerous references to the Russian mill blogger community. We cite you very often, and we talk about this about these people. And we get a lot of comments about, well, how do you know that they're any good? I mean, how do you decide which ones to quote, which others to quote? Could you just give us a quick view on who you see the Russian mill blogger community as being, how reliable you think they are, and how you decide which ones to cite and look further into and which ones you ditch?
That's a wonderful question and a very loaded question for sure. Truth be told, it is a matter of practice. After working on the updates for almost, I think it's 900 days, you get to know people's biases. You get to know what triggers them. You get to know what are some of the areas that they lie about, and what are the topics that they're trying to amplify, or if they're promoting some sort of an official. So it's a technique of studying biases, frankly. So after some time, everyone on our team learns how to identify a particular opinion of a mill blogger. And also, it is a combination of comparing and contrasting with other sources. So you can't just rely on Russian mill bloggers and their maps and their reports of captured villages. You also have to take everything in consideration and in comparison with satellite imagery, with OSINT reports, with Ukrainian government official statements, with the previous reported locations of Russian forces, and think really logistically in terms of logically in which to identify whether a particular source is truthful or not. So it is a tricky and big craft. It's a huge undertaking. And yeah, hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Another one, there seems to be this Kursk and Belgorod operation born in large part out of, I think, Russian arrogance, that they thought Ukraine was just so maxed out trying to hold back the tide in the Donbass and elsewhere that they could take the risk and leave the border largely unguarded. What do you see happening up and down the rest of the open flank, the open border that Ukraine has with Russia, non-occupied Ukraine has with Russia? We think Russia are pushing some elements of troops into or from Ukraine into the Kursk-Belgorod region. But is there also, do you see activity happening up and down the rest of the border area?
So from the Ukrainian side, we don't monitor Ukrainian force concentrations or Ukrainian deployments, so I don't really necessarily know much beyond Kursk or what we're seeing in Belgorod, for example. I can talk to you a little bit about some of the lateral redeployments that we saw on the Russian side. So what are some of the elements that they're moving from other non-critical front lines? Namely, they're really using a lot of the elements from Kherson Oblast as well as Zaporizhia Oblast to move up in an effort to address some of the parts of the incursion zone. We also saw some irregular forces being transferred from the critical front lines in Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar. However, that is very limited, and irregular forces versus regular forces, there's obviously discrepancies in size, in echelon. It could be called a battalion, but it's not actually a battalion. It's probably like 50 to 100 people for many irregular forces. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the Russian side. I unfortunately can't comment on the Ukrainian developments simply because this is not something that I focus on a daily basis.
No problem. Wouldn't ask you to comment either. Last one for me before I hand back to Mr. Garlic Bananas. I've said in the past that I don't think that Russia, certainly the Russian MOD, is a learning organisation. Took a bit of flack for it. And of course, what's the difference between learning or adapting? I accept Russia has adapted these glide bombs and what have you, and the meat assaults and blah, blah, blah. But I still don't think it's a learning organisation. I think because they've never really been tested. They've never really been pushed in this since the start of the full-scale invasion. They've never been pushed as they have been now with this combined arms assault. So I don't know. I've not seen any evidence that they are a properly learning at the operational level, learning organisation. Do you think they are? And do you think they are able to learn and transform in contact in the face of combined arms manoeuvre?
I agree with you that the Russians don't learn on the operational level. It is simply because Russians have shown time and time again that they cannot operationally plan. Kharkiv offensive is a prime example of that. In theory, the Kharkiv offensive should have helped Russian forces to fix Ukrainians so that they could advance in Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar and make a massive breakthrough. The Russians had to rush that. They had to rush it because of political reasons, because the US finally passed the supplemental aid to support Ukraine. In terms of operational planning, it's in learning. For Russians, there's a big problem in sharing that knowledge. So we know that Russians learn on a tactical level. We see them adapt to certain environments. One of the prime examples is the 58th Combined Arms Army of the Southern Military District that is operating in Zaporizhia Oblast. They have shown some really interesting tactical learning, whether it's erecting fortifications and improving their positions and using drones in combat. That knowledge mostly stays within that military district. It doesn't really go beyond that. And a lot of times we're seeing various levels of skill that one military district had mastered while others didn't. And it's largely because the Russians don't have cross-military district training right now. They never really had many of those trainings, but right now it's even worse. There's not much of information spreading, I guess. And that is a big component that adds on to Russian inability to learn on a military level. The other problem with this is that we know that Putin is a micromanager. He micromanages a lot of Russian military operations on a tactical to operational level. So if you have Putin dictating a political need for example, Russian capture of Krynki in Kherson Oblast, which we have seen him do in December 2023, and you are a military commander, a Russian military commander, and you have a different perspective on how to use your forces, it creates a dilemma where the political objective is overpowering a lot of the military rationale, and that prevents a lot of Russian military learning. So in the case of Kursk and Belgorod Oblast, I do think that it's Putin's policy decision-making as it relates to political problems that had led us to this point where Ukrainians could make this incursion. And it really tells you how much the political side of things really challenges Russian military learning.
Coming up, we hear Dom and Kateryna's final thoughts. Dom, what do you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So I'm obviously still looking at the Kursk-Belgorod operation. I've got half an eye on if and when Ukraine culminates, which, as I said in the past, military term meaning that your force is exhausted. So it's not necessarily going back, but it's no longer able to go forward. And where's that point of culmination and what does it mean? What happens next? So I'm looking out for things like Russian social media showing lots of destroyed Ukrainian equipment, especially the Western donated stuff. They would love to show that. There's not really been much of that so far, which tells me that the momentum is still with Ukraine. Secondly, wider reporting, both from Russian MOD, the mill blogger community we've just been hearing about from Kateryna, and trusted geolocation, i.e. from the reporting likes of ISW. Anything demonstrably showing, trustworthy, credibly showing Ukraine being pushed back. And then if there is a culmination point and Ukraine decides that they can't go any further forward, if they decide that that's the point, they go, right, we've done enough here, we're going to get out in good order, I would expect to see, and more about this than me, please do let us know, I would expect to see a much greater use of indirect fire at that point, artillery, mortars, but any other kind of indirect fire, in order to help the Ukrainians break contact and then start going backwards, falling through a rearward passage of lines. So I'm looking out for those kind of signs to show me what phase this Ukrainian assault is in. And even though the advance seems to have slowed down, Alexander Syrsky saying yesterday 1 to 2 kilometers a day, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not seeing any big signs yet that Ukraine's running out of steam, either physically or conceptually. I think they're still on the front foot and still going forward. But, let me know, folks, what signs are you looking for to see if and when Ukraine is running out of puff or decides to do something other than take death and destruction to their country's enemies?
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Kateryna, you've got the very last thoughts for today. What did you want to leave our listeners with?
I would probably just say that Russia had the initiative throughout the entire theater since fall of 2023. And the Russians had effectively controlled where the action started, when it started, and on what terms. The Ukrainians are now, they were forced to respond to a lot of Russian activities. And the operations in Kursk are now forcing Russians to do the same, essentially forcing the Russians to respond and contest the initiative to some extent. I think it is too early to tell how significant this development will be, but forcing Russians to react and fight on the terms that Ukraine had established and at the timing that Ukraine had established is crucial in our understanding of Russia's weaknesses and also in restoring some sort of more maneuverable warfare.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter or X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Francis Dearnley and Giles Gear. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.